We're live. Um, Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're joined this hour by Luis Rodriguez, author, essayist, just living legend. We're really thrilled. This is being presented today by the Dawes Center for the Arts. The Dawes Center in Pomona, California, is a not-for-profit art gallery space where we kind of try and promote the arts as well as offer workshops to help people really shine in their full you know get their full what's in them out in the world. So um, that's what we do over there, and we could not be more. We're related. We are elated to have be joined this hour by Luis Rodriguez. Luis, let's just get right into this. So you're known as a poet. You're known more recently having your as a memoir. I mean, having your memoir interpreted into a play. You're known as a memoirist. You're known as many things. What people might not know about you is that much of you got a lot of your early writings were actually in the field of journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I wanted to do as a writer is to start with journalism because I felt that that was the area of where information, facts, history, and also what was going on could be explored. I wanted to be one of these journalists that brought the truth out. There was so much going on in the 80s when I first started doing journalism. Reagan was the president. The Iran Contra affair was going on. There was a whole mess of stuff with drugs and homelessness at the level that we're seeing now. Permanent homelessness was beginning. We lost a lot of industry during that period. I worked in those steel mills and auto plants and oil refineries. I worked in them, and I decided to let it all go in 1980. I started doing my journalism. I was fortunate in many ways. One, I worked at San Bernardino Sun, so I was a crime reporter. So I got to be on all the crime, but one of the things that was happening was the DEA was very active. It was starting to become active because all the major drugs were coming through Mexico. It used to be marijuana and heroin, opium, but now cocaine, because they had closed the Caribbean routes for the Colombians. So the Colombians were working through Mexico. But here's the reason people don't know. They were doing that because the US wanted to use drugs and the drug income to destroy the revolutionary socialist communist movements in Nicaragua with the Sandinistas, with the FMLN in El Salvador, with the revolutions in Guatemala. In other words, Central America was in a upheaval, and they actually worked with the biggest drug lords you can imagine, and in fact created the first cartels in Mexico to do all this. People don't know this. I studied it. When I remember I would go on raids with SWAT, with sheriff's deputies, but also DEA as a reporter. And I remember the planes that would come in to the dry lakes around the Mojave Desert from these. That never happened like this before, and bringing in kilos of coke that eventually became crack in the inner city, and went from there. And the CIA supported that because their goal was to end communism, not drugs. They did in Afghanistan. They worked with all the drug lords and everything they could just to stop the social revolutionary motion. So I got to witness that. I also went to Mexico and did stories out of there, uprisings of indigenous people, campesinos. And I also went to Nicaragua and Honduras. I was there during the Contra War and got shot at twice and bombed twice and shot at by 50 caliber bullets. Couldn't happen to me, but I was right in the middle of that war. So I have a lot of background during that period when Reagan was breaking the law, when we were all being pushed into wars that we didn't want to be into, and when the deindustrialization had just spiraled to the point where people were in the street, people had no more jobs, and very little was being done. I think they lost like 4 million jobs during the Reagan administration, but even though he came up with about 2 million new jobs, almost all of them were in Walmarts, Kmart's, those kind of jobs. That became the Walmarting of America that we see today. So I don't know, I can go on and on, but that was a very good, important. I also covered a lot about the undocumented, the
Yeah.
raids that were going on. So that was important for me that I could come in there and begin to open up the terrible injustices that were being done with people that didn't have any papers. At the time, they were mostly from Mexico, but as you know, the civil wars were bringing in Salvadorian, Guatemalans, Hondurans, so they were becoming a very important part of that whole migrant stream from from Central America to Mexico.
I think our audience would definitely be very interested in hearing about the time, the '80s when you were there, in Central America during the Dirty Wars and during the Civil Wars that were being pushed by the United States. But before we get into that, what was your relationship like with the San Bernardino Sun, with the editorial staff and the higher ups?
It's a very important story. I brought up in my memoir. I didn't have a good relationship. The editor was a Republican, and I was trying to cover stories like police abuse, which was bad for them. They didn't want to do that, of undocumented raids. I wanted to even do good stories. I didn't want to just do the crime and disaster and drug stories. I wanted to do stories of community organizing, the community getting together, community culture. I would meet at the Mikla Cafe that you and me had, I think, a coffee or a taco there one time. It was at the center of a lot of community there. And I would meet there and find all kinds of our leaders and community organizers and talk with them and try to do those stories. What ended up happening is the San Bernardino police had killed a homeless man by choking him. And at the time, chokeholds were outlawed in Southern California, at least some of the big cities, San Bernardino, LA, of course, and everything else. They still did it. But their official response was that he had swallowed a bag of marijuana and choked on it. And I did the rest investigation, did the research, and found out that that wasn't true. So I put it out in the paper, and the editor went crazy because it turned out he was playing golf with the police chief every Sunday. And they conspired to try to undermine me, set me up. I realized what was happening, and I had to quit on my own. I resigned. This is not journalism. Journalism is about the truth. I don't care whether you like it or not. And you're not being a journalist. You're not being proper to the trade and the craft. And I'm getting out. I was already sending my clippings around the Southern California and got great responses from the LA Times, the LA Herald Examiner that was still around, the Press Enterprise out of Riverside, the Long Beach paper, the Pasadena people, they all loved it, but they never came back and called me. And I found out later that my editor had blacklisted me as a communist advocate, and I couldn't work in newspapers again in Southern California. No newspaper would hire me. So that's the way they work. That's the net level of where they're at. It was fine because I did much better than I even imagined beyond that, but I had to struggle on my own to find my own freelance outlets, to find magazines that were published. I was working for the People's Tribune out of Chicago. They were publishing a lot of my work, but also other left publications that were interested in what I was doing. I did stuff for the LA Weekly, I did stuff for the Santa Barbara News and Review and a lot of other publications just to keep doing it. And then I ended up in news radio doing writing for the anchor. So it didn't end my life. It just was sad that people like me trying to bring the truth out were being blacklisted, and that's what people should know.
Yeah, no, that definitely the people should be aware that those are kind of the risks you take when you try to use these major outlets to tell the truth, because they're not really in the truth business. It's very interesting though that you've accomplished a lot. You've moved into some of these large outlets of society, but you still retain your the same spirit that you had when you got in. That's actually pretty rare. I mean, most people, it's some people are able to, they have integrity and they stick with their politics, but they don't go so high.
Right.
Other people, they start going high and they just leave that behind.
Yeah.
How have you been able to retain the truth, your truth telling, and also keep succeeding at these higher and higher levels where truth telling is so uncommon?
Well, I think you have to have a vision and an orientation. I got oriented very young, in my late teens, into revolutionary social justice struggles, a study, and it oriented me to know that I'm going to be in this thing for the right reasons. I wasn't doing it for a career boost. I wasn't doing it for my own sake. It was to, again, expand the level of consciousness and knowledge into our community, especially for the working class of this country, because I was working class and I wanted to influence and be part of that. I'm Chicano, so I wanted to be part of the whole Chicano development and giving them the revolutionary orientation. So I was clear about that. But being a journalist, people say, well, you can't have that kind of orientation. It's BS. The thing about journalism, though, is you have to be accurate. I didn't have to make up stuff. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I didn't have to lie. I didn't have to misrepresent. There was so much bad stuff happening. Again, among the homeless, I did work with them. Among the undocumented, the kind of things, they were terrible things were going on. What was going on in Mexico with the uprisings, what's going on in Central America with the civil wars, as well as these kind of craziness with the Contras, the dirty wars that the U.S. financed and kept going. So there is so much news. I didn't have to lie or misrepresent it. I just had to try to bring in as much of it as possible to be comprehensive. And to me, that was what journalism was really about. There was a few journalists doing it, but as you know, and as you say, a lot of journalists gave up that. I think they gave up their own craft, their own vision. I remember going to Managua, and there used to be a hotel, the International Hotel, where all the U.S. journalists would hang and party and drink. I would go in there, try to get press releases and things, and I realized it's all State Department stuff, and they would just saying what the State Department said. So I would go to the streets, talk to the people. I knew Spanish. I could hear, I could understand, I could speak it. So what happened is I was getting stories from the people, you know what I'm saying? And they weren't. And I realized that there were journalists that didn't really care about the craft or the truth. I had to be one of those journalists that did. So it cost me in some cases, but it also opened doors. I think there are some people, even at certain levels, that want to know um, who are those journalists? There's a few, a few of them, some of them in Truth Out and other important publications, Mint and others, Great Palace. There's a lot of other people out there trying to get the truth out against great odds, again, being good journalists. So there's people out there, but there wasn't as many as I wish there were. There's a lot of people that made it a career. And I hate to say this, but some of the Chicano journalists wouldn't back me up. I went to the Chicano Journalists Association to tell them about what my editor had done. They would not back me up. They said, you probably didn't do something right. I go, they blamed me, except I have to give credit to Frank Del Olmo. He was on the LA Times editorial board. A really interesting, nice, had a suit and tie, seemed like a regular guy. Didn't seem to have any revolutionary bone. I don't think he did it for that. He was just somebody that wanted to help our people and saw that what had happened. So he opened doors for me. He passed on, as you know. I have a lot of respect for him because he did that. I mean, who would do that? So there are certain people that did step up and say, this isn't right. And he allowed me to do some things with the LA Times editorial board, including when I was working in Uchitan, Oaxaca, and the uprisings there. I brought people from Uchitan, from the COSEI, which was the revolution organization that was organizing all these uprisings with the Zapoteco people. And he allowed me to bring them to the editorial board of the LA Times so that they could cover some of these stories. So Uchitan became a big, big issue in Mexico. There's books, there's photo books, there's a lot of things, and I was there. And so again, I have to give credit to people like Frank Del Olmo. There was others, but most of them, unfortunately, were scared and didn't want to rock any boats. And that's not me, you know what I mean?
You mentioned it's, we're gonna take a little side tour here, but you were talking about these journalists who have shown bravery and courage. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Chicano moratorium,
Yeah.
where Ruben Salazar took his life. So could you speak, for those who might not be aware, could you tell us a little about Ruben Salazar and also tell about your own story coming out of the Chicano moratorium?
Well, Ruben Salazar at the time was a hero to many of us because he was a journalist. But he was in the LA Times, and when he died, he was working for KMX TV, the Spanish language TV station. He was trying to tell the story of Chicanos. He was clear, I'm a Chicano. I want to tell these stories. Very few journalists, Chicano or otherwise, were doing that. And most of them, there wasn't that many Chicanos anyway at the time. We respected him for that. He was also a good journalist. He tried to get the truth out. Again, we didn't make up stuff. He didn't have to lie. He just brought the accuracy of what was happening. And I think he was a thorn in the side to the fourth estate, about some of what's going on with our communities. I am convinced he was murdered by the sheriff's deputies. There's a lot of things that shows that they actually targeted him, were following him, and shot a tear gas canister into an occupied building, which you're never supposed to do with tear gas canisters. Those guys are trained not to do it. They actually did. There's pictures showing that they did that. And then later on, somebody came in with guns, and apparently they heard shots, and he was killed. I know a lot of the stuff is being questioned by the sheriffs, by Lee Baca, he's in prison now. All these people that, justified everything, now they're in prison. So my attitude is that it stands. He was murdered. It's hard to get all the facts, obviously, but there's enough you can conclude. That was a big shame. My participation was I was a gang member. I was on drugs. I was homeless. I was not going to school. I was not doing very well. But the Chicano moratorium woke me up. I ended up going there mainly to party. You know, I thought it was a big giant party, 30,000 people gathered in East LA. But the movement swept me, the anti-war sentiments, the community, the raza coming together, organizing. There was so much enthusiasm, so much unity. We had almost every barrio, every neighborhood, and a lot of other people showed up. It was Chicanos, but also Puerto Ricans and also Native Americans and African Americans and a bunch of progressive white people there. There was a lot of resistance, and it was the first um, anti-war protest in the community of color at a massive level. And I'm convinced it also helped change the whole um, tenure about it because now community of colors were stepping up. African Americans, others were stepping up against the war. It used to be just, it seemed to be just these college students, white kids going against the war. Now it became a working class community was saying no. And I was part of that. Unfortunately, I was one of the first ones arrested. They ended up arresting about 5 of us cholos, you know, Chicano gang kids, tattooed, big khaki pants, long shirts, Pendletons. I was beaten down. They busted my head. They took me to juvenile hall. They took me to first of all, to the East LA Sheriff Substation, the juvenile hall, to two men's facilities, and then I ended up in Murder's Row. And the reason why they took us there in the middle of the night. They had arrested like hundreds of people, but within 2 or 3 hours, all of them were gone except for us. They kept us in Murder's Row for several days and nights. I had a cell next to Charles Manson, who was going to trial at the time. I was assaulted by two big giant guys that were in my cell, but I stood up to them. I wasn't scared. I've been to the street. I've been homeless. I stood up to them. I might be a short Mexican, but as you know, short Mexicans were some of the toughest people in the prison, in the streets and the prison. So they didn't scare me. And they were okay as long as I didn't cave in or get scared. You know, you can't get scared in those situations. But I was always wondering what the heck they're going to get us for. And the deputies were threatening that they were going to charge us for the murders of people that died in the East LA riot that followed the attacks that the law enforcement had done to the peaceful um, anti-war protests. It turned out that after several days and nights, they woke me up midnight, took me out, and I didn't quite get a good response. My friend Rosalio Munoz, who was the chairman of the chairperson of the Chicano moratorium at the time, years later, deduced that perhaps all the pictures that Chicano activists were taking, the film, the Super 8 film that was coming out only showed the police beating up people, only showed them killing people, including Ruben Salazar. In other words, there was no picture of me doing any damage to anybody. So I think that was partly the reason why they eventually let us go. I think if it was any other time and maybe those pictures didn't exist, we would have been set up like a lot of people were in that time. People were being killed. I think of Fred Hampton in Chicago and so many others, Bunchy Carter here in LA. There were so many leaders in the Black Panthers and even in the Brown Berets and AIM that were being set up, in prison, deported, and or killed. I would have been set up like all of them, and nobody would care, right? Who would care about this stupid gang kid from San Gabriel Valley? But I think the movement also helped me, and I decided soon after that I was going to begin to start taking steps away from the heroin, away from the gang violence, and try to better myself. I'm hooked up with some revolutionary Chicano activists in East LA. I started studying with them. They introduced me to all these great radical revolutionary thinkers and organizers. By the time I was 18, I was joined in. I did my last jail term at 18. And they helped me from serving a state prison term because they wrote letters on my behalf, went to the judge. They were going to try and get me for assaulting police officers. They said that I was fighting with 8 police officers in an incident, which I didn't get a chance to fight them because they beat the hell out of me. They jumped me. I was trying to protect this poor Chicana that was getting beaten up, and by the cops, she was already handcuffed from the ground, and they were kicking her, and I just couldn't stand it. I went to say, hey man, stop this stuff. And of course, that's not a gangster thing to do. I already moved from being a gangster. So this is what you do when you care about social justice and inequities. And sure enough, they were going to send me to prison. These people saved me from that. I ended up serving a lesser time in the county jail. I did get convicted, but I came out of there and made a promise that I would never go back to La Vida Loca, to the violence, to the drugs. I had my first heroin withdrawals in prison, in jail, and pretty much was stepping away from that world and entering a world of organization, of consciousness, of study, of being active in the world in a more powerful, visionary way. And I've been doing that ever since, almost 50 years now. So in many ways, I give these leaders and organizers big credit for saving a stupid, suicidal, homicidal young man like me and giving me something to hang on to that had meaning bigger than myself, cause, something that I could say I'm part of. And that has taken me through all the work I did in the industry and then later on in newspapers and radio, but also when I worked as a union organizer, when I worked as an artist, poet, going into prisons, everything, all my work that I've done, gang intervention, has been kind of flowing from those moments.
So you're politicized at an anti-war protest. You find yourself, 15 or so years later, in Central America. Again, another war. You find yourself protesting the Vietnam War. Now the U.S. is at war with Central America. Proxy covert wars, and you yourself were almost killed. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that incident?
So what happened is I was there with the Sandinistas, and we were going all over Nicaragua, speaking to all kinds of people. They were under attack by the Reagan administration. They brought in journalists to come in there to see what they were doing, that they were in fact had the largest literacy campaign in all of the Americas at the time. I think Cuba might have had even the biggest one. They were also providing people with foods and jobs and all kinds of things that weren't there. They were trying to let people know that they were not destroying the country, nor imprisoning everybody that they were claiming, nor were they slaughtering people in the streets that the Reagan administration was putting out there. And I went there. And again, I was allowed to go into the streets to talk to people. It wasn't just them showing me what they wanted to show me. I went and found out exactly from what other people thought and what was going on. But at a certain point, the Contra War was happening. And they had to put a lot of resources to the border, especially with Honduras. So I asked to go down there. I said, I want to see what this is about, because they were insisting that the U.S. was supporting the Contras. In the U.S., Reagan could not do that. The Congress had actually said, you can't. They put in a thing where you couldn't go down there, and Reagan was undermining it. And of course, this is important. If Reagan's undermining, we need to know. So I went to the Rio Coco, which is in Honduras, and we went across with the Sandinistas in a Jeep. It was me, another Chicano journalist, and myself, because they invited all these Chicanos and others, but we were the two only Chicanos there. And we went over, and with binoculars, I could see the highly resourced Contras. They weren't, in the jungles like the revolutionaries had done before, starving, trying to survive. They had tents, they had big tanks, they had a lot of equipment, they were uniforms. The US had given them a lot of resources. But as we were looking in the binoculars, all of a sudden a 50 caliber bullet comes right by. They saw us, maybe they glared at the binoculars, who knows, and cut a tree in half. It was that powerful. So we knew we better get the hell out of there. So we climbed up back down, got into this Jeep, and started driving like crazy. The Sandinista guy was driving like a madman. One bomb that came at us was a little bit distant. It shook the whole thing. There was dust everywhere, but we didn't get hit. So we kept going. And the next one that came, you could hear the whistle. It was kind of like one of those, it had a wing, kind of a bomb. It went over, you could hear this whistling. And then all of a sudden I knew it was gonna go right in front of the Jeep. The guy, for some reason, braked. I don't know why, maybe he did it as a reflex. He braked. We all put our hands above our heads like, that's gonna save us. It was dumb, we weren't gonna make it. But what happened is after we did that, everything got really quiet. Even the birds stopped singing. I don't know what was going on. And we were alive. And we didn't know what was going on. So the Sandinista guy looks over and he gets out of the Jeep and he goes over and he realizes the bomb had landed right in front of us. He braked. Maybe it was the right thing that he did that. Yeah. And it was like a pineapple-sized bomb that had been embedded in the dirt. It was a dud. It didn't mean it couldn't go off sometime, but at that moment it didn't go off. Yeah. And we looked at it and we saw it's U.S. ordnance, which again was proof that the U.S. was arming the Contras. So we did a stupid thing. It's stupid. I'll never do this again. We decided to take this bomb back, which is very dumb. The Sandinista guy got a towel from the Jeep. Slowly but surely, I didn't even touch it, but he was moving it. He was brave. I mean, we were all standing there like idiots, so we all got blown. But he moved it slowly, picked it out of the ground, wrapped it in this towel, and we brought it back. And you know what? I don't know how we did it. We ended up coming back to Nicaragua. It was just the strangest thing. It was surreal, I have to tell you. But we did have pictures of it. They kept it I took these pictures and I was going to go back to the US to show all the left publications that were then publishing what I was doing, what was happening. But I went through Miami and all my stuff was taken. Um, the customs people said they don't know where it went. They had no idea. I said I had one bag with all those pictures, and I kept some pictures for myself. But one thing I learned: you should never put your pictures in bags. You should always keep it on your in your own bag that you carry. I put some in there; they were gone. I kept a few little ones, but I might have a picture of that bomb. I'm not sure which ones were actually. I have a lot of negatives I have to go through, but the point is, I lost a lot of work, a lot of journals. Uh, and then customs says we don't know what happened. Well, it turns out months later, the box that actually all the stuff was in had come. It actually had been opened, and they put taper on it. I don't know why they didn't even send it home. They should just kept it. Some other junk was there, but all my pictures and all that I brought was gone. My film and everything that was gone. So I learned a big lesson, but it didn't stop me from writing about it. And mainly the People's Tribune out of Chicago was the main publication that carried those stories. I had other people interested, but none of the big publications. I went to San Jose Mercury, which I had written for, and other publications. Nobody wanted it. They didn't want the story of the U.S. Army Contras. And as you know, later on, it was actually found out to be true. What's his name, Gary Webb out of San Jose Mercury broke a big story about the connection between drugs in the U.S. and the Contras and all this stuff. The Contra-Iran affair got a big deal. Oliver North got, arrested, and then with immunity, he ended up exposing a lot of other people. Many people got sent to prison, but they wouldn't take my story, which is just the way it goes. They weren't listening to Chicanos, even though we were telling the truth. That's fine, as long as people know what the truth is. It turned out that everything I was trying to do proved that it was actually happening.
And you got yourself now in a position where you can tell this story, and now people know. But
Yeah.
So what's interesting though, earlier you mentioned there's still some good journalists, and the name that just popped out was Greg Palast.
Yeah.
Now the interesting thing about Greg is I actually work with Greg a lot, and we actually had a show together where we're doing this poet slash journalist, like who's the poet, who's the journalist, and telling the truth in this age, and et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that Greg really wants in life now, in this chapter of his life, is to also put in a chapter of Greg Palast, the poet, right?
Yeah.
So he's like trying to write more poetry and get known for poet, but obviously known as a journalist. You, on the other hand, are known as a poet, but you also do journalism. So it's really interesting how poets and journalists and all these disciplines kind of just meld into this kind of truth telling kind of thing. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey, your beginnings? How did you get started writing poetry, and what were some of those formative experiences as a poet?
Well, I started writing these, I don't know, they were poems, these little anecdotes, little thoughts, little ideas when I was a teenager, believe it or not. I loved to read. Might have been in the street, might have been on drugs and in gangs, but I was a big reader. I would go to the downtown library, homeless, walk through there and just read as many books as I could. I first came across poetry there. Mostly the poetry that I liked was African Americans, because there was no Chicano poets that I knew of at the time. And from the old Leroy Jones, who's a Mary Baraka, who passed away, to Donnell Lee, who became Haki Marabuti, who was a friend of mine in Chicago. I was reading, and Giovanni, what's her name? Nikki Giovanni. There was a lot of great poets. Later on, Sonia Sanchez and others, Eldridge Knight. I started reading all these guys and people and women, and it was powerful for me. And so I was interested, but I didn't know what poetry was. And when I was 18, I was fortunate that I won a Chicano Literary Prize for El Grito magazine, the Chicano Literary Prize out of Berkeley. I won an honorable mention. I didn't win the big one. And they invited me to go to Berkeley and gave me $250. I was like 18 years old. That was a lot of money for somebody trying to get out of gangs. That was big time, especially when it wasn't crime related. So I ended up going on my first flight ever in a plane, which for all the things I'd been through, shot at, and one was being killed in Murder's Row and all kinds of things, all the heroin overdoses. I was more scared of that flight than anything else. That was like the scariest thing. I ended up in Berkeley, and I was still using heroin at the time. And so I was thinking one night that I'm going to sneak away and score. You always find some way to score. I didn't know who, where, but I would find a place to score. But as I was walking out in this little hotel we were in, the people were all that invited me had come in and asked me to join them for poetry reading, and I didn't want to go at some cafe in Brooklyn. I don't remember what it was, but they said yes, you're going. Oh, okay, I went, but I said I'm going to sneak out. I'll score later. I'll sneak out. So I go with them, and we're in this cafe, and then it turns out that the three poets that were reading were the great Chicano, we call the Godfather of Chicano poetry, Jose Montoya. There was David Henderson, who at the time was one of the leading African-American performance poets. And there was the great Puerto Rican, New Yorican poet, Pedro Piatri. Can you imagine three of the best were in this room, in this cafe, and I'm sitting there, and they literally knocked me out. Hearing their words, hearing how they took us position, hearing how their presence, you know what I'm saying? They took performance and words and language. I was so mesmerized by it that I never did go score that night. I was so mesmerized by it. This is what poetry can do. I wanted to know about poetry. I wanted to know how to do this. You know what I'm saying? Some people probably won't take that. They listen to that. That's fine. That's great. Fine. They leave. But I was like, I want to know about this. So I spent a few years trying to figure out what the poets were in LA. Started going to Al's Bar. I don't know if you remember, it was famous for a while. Started going to a few places in Echo Park, and I met with the LA Latinos Writers Association that had started and trying to bring in Chicanos together to do poetry and art and all kinds of things. They were working with OSCO, they were working with Self-Help Graphics, and I joined them. I met the great poet Manasar Gamboa, who became my mentor teacher. He had done 17 years in prison. It was a 20-year heroin addict, but had got clean and was now helping Chicanos with their writing and poetry. I met others, and I started doing my writing. This was by the time it was like the late 70s. And we even started a gallery in Echo Park. The first art gallery wasn't white gentrification. It was all Chicano. It was called Galeria Ocaso. I was a poetry curator, and we would have artwork, bands, performances, poets, all kinds of amazing things. I think it was around for about 5 years. We were unprecedented at the time. Even Gronk came in and did paintings right on the wall. He didn't have paintings, in frames. He just painted right on the wall. We had that for the longest time. We ended up painting it over, and he said, "Paint it over. I do it. I can do it anytime." We had some amazing stuff. It eventually had to close down because we couldn't afford the rent. You know how that goes. And now there's a bunch of art galleries in Echo Park now. Most of them have nothing to do with Chicanos, and they don't even know that we started the first one. Of course, it was for the community that we were in. Anyway, I got involved with that, and that helped me consider poetry as a way of writing, expressing, and be doing the revolutionary work I was doing. By 1980, I was in journalism, but I never gave it to poetry. And then by 1985, I ended up in Chicago. And just so happened by 85, 86, the poetry slam scene was birthing in Chicago. I happened to land there just as it was happening. So I would go to the cafes, bars, and libraries and meet all these great poets, and slam poetry was happening. I would go to the Green Mill Lounge. I knew Mark Smith, Patricia Smith, and me were coming in together with Michael War and a bunch of other people. We ended up being very active in that scene. David Hernandez was our friend. He was one of the leading performance poets. Tony Fitzpatrick, Cindy Salash, Lisa Buscani. I can give you all these names of all these people who were coming out of that. And I was very fortunate to have done it, but also by 1989 decided to do a press that would do my book, which it did, my first poetry book, Poems Across the Pavement, but it became so, I was selling it out of the trunk of my car. People loved it so much that they wanted to say, "Can you publish us?" So it became the poetry press in the beginning of all the slam poets that were really good on the page, not just the stage. Those poets, you could read them, but also you could see them perform. So that's what started the Achucha Press, which is over 30 years ago. And I'm still doing the Achucha Press even today. So I just got into poetry more and more after that. I never gave it up and had other poetry books. I've had 8 poetry books now since then.
So that formative night, where you saw, Jose Montoya and
Yeah.
legendary poets, that night that you saw them, you also that became a poem that you
Yeah.
wrote, right? Please don't. Please don't say that poem. Is that?
No, the poem is called Fevered Sentences or Fevered Shapes, because it was then I realized that that's what they were bringing out. They were shaping language with fever, with consciousness, with something. It wasn't just I'm a poet and I'm reading in front of a mic. There was so much energy, and I wanted to capture that. I also did write a poem. Don't read that poem. And it was about Patricia Smith, and it was about the poetry slam scene in Chicago. And that poem became one of my signature poems. I used to read that all the time, and it's on my CD, and it gets around wherever it can.
Well, I've seen you perform both of them several times, and there's something to be said about that. That two of your signature pieces are actually about other people, about other poets, about where it speaks a lot to the generosity of your spirit, and how much you really are invested in 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 seeing this better world. It's not just about you and building your name and reputation. You really are invested in this larger fight. Um, so that's incredible. So I mean, like, so you've been a journalist, you're a poet, you go to slam. Then something else happens in your life. You write this little book, and it goes on to do some things, right? A little memoir, little
Yeah.
little reflection. Tell our audience about the writing, the publication,
So
and everything goes with always running.
yeah, that for 20 years I had always running in me. I would write bits and pieces. I even did a novel of it, which was a waste of time, but it was really a memoir. It wasn't a novel, it wasn't fiction. I had to do it for what it was, a nonfiction, true story of what I went through in the streets, but also how I got out of it. And I did it because my own son joined a gang in Chicago, which is really sad. I didn't raise my son, I didn't raise my daughter, but they both came at me as troubled teens, both of them. They're 2 years apart. He was 13. She came 2 years later, and they were both in bad shape. And I didn't know how to be a dad, to be honest with you. I was trying. I just had a new baby with my third wife, Trini, and then later on we had another baby, and I had these crazy teenagers with me. And my son joined the gang when he was 15 in Chicago in the Puerto Rican neighborhood of Humboldt Park. It got really bad in the 90s. As you may know, 90s was the worst period for gang violence in LA, Chicago, and other cities. He got right into the middle of it. So much death, so many people being killed. It's worse than what Chicago is today. Chicago still has a lot of violence, but not compared to those days. So I got active in gang intervention because of my son. I was doing it before when I was younger. I let it go for a while, but then I came really strong in Chicago, started working with all the mostly Puerto Rican Mexican gangs out of Pilsen Little Village, Humboldt Park, Logan Square, then eventually spread out to the south side, to Cabrini Green, to all kinds of communities. So we work with black and brown, as well as some a few white gang kids, but mostly black and brown. My son, I was trying to save him through that work. I decided that one of the things I would do was also write this memoir. And I would have to say that Curbstone Press out of Connecticut did my second poetry book, The Concrete River, which is probably today my best-selling poetry book. I went to them and said, would you be interested in this memoir? And I have to say that Sandy Taylor and Judith Doyle, who were the founders and really revolutionary young, but they were quite that young, but they were active people in literature, especially of Latin America and Chicanos, supported me all the way. Always Running came out in January of 1993. I decided to quit all my work. I was working at a radio station, doing writing. I did stuff for CNN, for Westinghouse, for NBC. I gave up everything. That was the last job. That was the job I had longer than any job, about 5 years. I didn't have jobs very long, but I quit everything and decided to go on a tour that Curbstone financed, 30 cities in 3 months. It was so popular, Always Running. I was on Oprah Winfrey. I was in Good Morning America. I was in Entertainment Weekly. I was in magazines and all kinds of things. The book was being published in Philadelphia Inquirer magazine, and the Los Angeles Times, and Chicago Tribune. The New York Times called it a notable book. It was getting around, and it sold. I mean, when I was on Oprah Winfrey, the 5 minutes she featured it, 20,000 copies just got sold because of that. And so it was like an accident. I would people say it's not an accident, but my attitude is I didn't plan for it. I didn't understand that what people were interested in is a year before the LA uprising had happened in 92. And then they all knew about LA gangs, but they didn't understand. So Shaika Shakur did his book Monster at the same time that my book came out. So we were the two premier urban gang stories, one from an African-American Crip viewpoint and the other from a Chicano barrio perspective. And they became both the two big popular gang books. There's been others since then, but we were like the first ones to break through. And again, the LA Uprising, all these things helped me. I had no idea. The timing, which was perfect. I didn't plan it. And by then, all these major publishers that had rejected me before, that I couldn't even get, 22 publishers rejected my work. They all vied for the bidding to do the paperback. And Simon and Schuster, through Touchstone Books, their imprint, ended up doing the paperback in '94. And by then the book took off. It's already sold 500,000 copies or more. And it's been quite a ride. You know what I'm saying? It hasn't stopped in 27 years. It has been going and going. It's in LA and California and other places. It's been one of the most checked out library books, but as everybody knows, it's also one of the most stolen books. It's used in schools, it's in prisons and everywhere. So the book has really, I wish other people like my other books just as well, because I like them all. Some of them I think are better than Always Winning. It doesn't matter. Always Winning is my one big seller, my best, most important book. And of course, I'm blessed by having had that Always Winning. It's opened a lot of doors. So now I've been published by myself, been published by small publishers, as well as the big boys. HarperCollins eventually did my novel and short story collection. And I got children's books. I got all kinds of books out there now. But Always Winning was the open all those doors, and I had to walk through these doors. I couldn't take the situation as, I'm just going back to the same old, same old. I used this as an opportunity to say, I want to speak to more people. I'm going to walk through these doors, and maybe it's messed up. Maybe there's some betrayal there. Maybe they're not really going to do what they claim to do. I didn't matter. I used it to get out there and speak and be in a bigger situation as far as the voice that needed to be out there in the world.
Yeah. Incredible. So you mentioned, Always Running is kind of this book that has taken on a life of its own. But you have other books. You have other, not poetry books. We'll call it that. And I know I've spoken with you about this, that your favorite of your own work was Music of the Mill.
Yeah.
And I was actually, when I was in Florida, speaking of Florida, Paul Ortiz, by way of introducing me, started talking about you, and he talked about this wonderful book by Luis Rodriguez, Music of the Mill. So that book has found an audience, and there are people who are very devoted followers to it. But can you tell our audience a little bit about the book Music of the Mill?
So it's my first novel. It's my only novel, to be honest with you. And the thing, this is my wife, by the way, Trini.
Oh my goodness.
Yes,
My goodness.
say hi.
Oh, sorry.
So she's always welcome here. So come in whenever she wants. But the point is that Music of the Mill was my attempt to tell a working class story. There wasn't too many working class books. Maybe you had them in the 20s and 30s and 40s, but there really wasn't happening in the current literature. And I wanted to tell the story about the demise of the industry. The Rust Belt, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, all these places went down in the 80s. But people forget that the largest Rust Belt wasn't even in the Rust Belt. It was Los Angeles. LA had the largest manufacturing center, had every industry that everybody had. It didn't have them as big, didn't have the big steel mills like Gary, Indiana, or Chicago, but it had steel mills. It didn't have the big auto plants like Detroit, but it had auto plants. It didn't have the largest garment industry like in New York, but it had it. We had canneries, we had oil and chemical refineries. We had so much industry. And just as everybody was getting deindustrialized, when that whole world was changing because of the automation, but also cheap labor in third world countries and all kinds of things, LA got hit hard. I wanted to tell that story of a Mexicano indigenous man walking across the border from Sonora, a Yaqui man, ended up in LA, and he worked with the land. The land was not, they were being pushed off the land. He ends up working in a steel mill. And there's a 3-generation story about 3 generations in the mill, including the middle generation of the son who becomes active in communist and revolutionary activity against the Ku Klux Klan, all the races and others that were working with the company to undermine unity of the workers in that mill. And these are all based on true stories, even though the story is fiction. I made it all up. The characters are made up. It's based on something that I remember when I worked at Bethlehem Steel in Los Angeles. And I wanted to tell that story. It also is a 3rd generation, is the daughter who's no longer able to work in the industry. and she has to find her way without industry imposing itself. So she becomes a musician, a singer, in a culture center, something like the Achucha Center Gudala, but I don't claim it that. Here in the Valley, she finds the center, a cafe. She walks in, there's music, there's art, there's poetry, there's all kinds of things happening. She begins to find her voice. And even though she was floating in the world with no jobs, having kids, didn't know what was going on, didn't know who she was going to be, she ends up becoming this artist, singer, um, conveyor of beautiful creative arts. And that's what I wanted to end with, that if industry leaves, we have to now move into a more creative space, not a creative space owned by the industry like Hollywood or fashion or ads or whatever, but the creative space that we create for ourselves, and that we can say the things that has to be said. And that's what's happening now, especially with the virtual world. People are using so much creativity. Some of it is maybe foolish, some of it don't make sense, but there's a lot of good stuff happening through the internet and other social media that is trying to give a message, trying to give people consciousness, awareness. And that's what I wanted to end that novel with.
Right. So okay. I'm born in 1981, right? And so there's still an industrial economy when I'm like a baby. By the time I'm 18 and gotta go get a job, the industrial economy is gone, and now we talk about a service economy. By the time I'm 30, there's no longer really even a service economy. Now we're talking about a gig economy. So this seems headed all in one direction, right? And you mentioned automation earlier. That seems to be one of the major driving factors. Where we are today is not where we were yesterday, and where we are today is not where we're going to be tomorrow. This is going to keep happening, keep going. What what do we do? What do we need to do not to die?
I know. This is the question that I think we're, especially now with this COVID-19 pandemic, everything has to shift. Here's what happened. Things already shifted technologically, but we're not shifting our social structures. We're not shifting our governance. We're not shifting from the capitalist system, which really blew up during the Industrial Revolution and some of the post-industrial revolution, but it's already archaic. It's already not going to maintain or sustain life, not going to sustain the world. It's actually hurting now because it's an old way of doing things. We need to move into a new governance, a new social structure, and a new way of seeing how we can align with advancements in technology, but also with a very important thing that I think this technology has to do, which is now aligning all resources to human needs. The reason that in capitalism, with all the wealth that created, we created more wealth gaps, we created more hunger, we created people uprooted, migrants, at war, constant war. There's been war ever since capitalism exploded. And now we got pandemics and sickness. It's all part of it. These things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because we were part of this terrible capitalist, industrial, post-industrial world that was always about profit, always about the few benefiting. Now we know that they benefited so well that the greatest gap in history of wealth and the poor is happening as we speak. So now I think we have to first imagine, because I think imagining is really part of the process, revolutionary process. Imagine what could be different. Imagine how we can feed everyone. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine how everybody could have decent healthcare, how everyone could have access to education without them costing anything, that we can see the end of war, that we can see the end of prisons. We have to imagine these things because they're possible. Imagination is a reflection of what's really going on in the material conditions of life, but it also takes you further. It takes you in that area where, like we used to say with revolutionary leaders, they usually felt deeper and could see further. That's where we all of us have to be at. Let's see further where things are going. What is all this pain and trauma trying to tell us? What is it trying to say? What has to die? And what has to be born out of the situation that we're in. That's where we're at. And that's where revolution comes in, because revolution is just a bunch of people in the gorilla mountains sitting there with guns and trying to overthrow things. That may happen. That has happened. Revolution is really looking at where society is going and how to take it to that next level. But again, it can't be at the level of more wealth for a few, more hunger and pain for the rest of us. It has to be the level that we feed and clothe and house and give creative means for all people, and break down these borders, break down every constraint to the power of people being fully energized, fully strong, fully healthy. Now we have to think about getting rid of the old, the archaic, and bring in the new. We got to be what many revolutionists have called midwives for a new world. And I think that's what I feel I have to do. help birth something new. It's big, it's hard, but through imagination and consciousness, we begin to open up the doors. At least people start thinking it's possible. And that to me is where things are at and where I'm at.
So we see in a pandemic that the capitalist economy that we live in is totally incapable of serving anyone's needs.
Yeah.
I mean, there's these mass shortages of things that should have been produced just in case,
Mhm.
but we can't do that in this economy
Yeah.
because everything's built to be sold, not for what they're used for.
Yeah.
Can you talk? Can you expand upon that a little bit, like how like capitalism really works? I don't think people understand. I think people think like I'm a capitalist. That means I like the idea of capitalism. I don't think they really get what it really.
They don't really know what they're saying when they say that. I've heard talk to people say I saw a guy at the airport saying I'm a capitalist. You could tell he's like a working class guy. It's just an ideology. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. Capitalists are the corporations, the big, large scale production people, the people who ended up owning all the means of production, all the factories, and all the major ways that products were being put out, and creating a consumer world out of the rest of us. And of course, exploiting everybody the best they can so they can profit off all this. Well, that world is completely being shifted. And I think one of the things with the pandemic, it shows that we have a fragile economy, we have a fragile political system. It's always been that way, but it takes these kind of a crisis to get people to realize there's fissures in all of this. We absolutely need a change. And that to me is where we're at. I know people get resistance to, well, it's socialism, it's communism, and all these things. I think that this is in beyond even thinking about whatever labels you want to give it. I think we can look at even new ways of calling it. I don't really care what you call it, as long as it does this and make sure the foundations exist for the betterment and thriving of every human being, not just deciding who makes it and who doesn't. That is a social construct that capitalism forces us into, because capitalism's main striving is profit, whereas a new society has to be the betterment of everyone. That's a different, the well-being of everyone. That's a different concept than the one we have under capitalism. And that's why it needs to be challenged. Private property has to be challenged. What is private property? That these small number of people own most of the property, most of the wealth, most of the land. They want to even control more of it. They privatize land. The air, the sky, and land should never be owned by anybody except maybe for the public good, for the commons, you know what I'm saying? But they're selling everything. They're selling space. They're selling moon spots. You know what I'm saying? There's all kinds of selling of things that should belong to all humanity, in the sense that everybody gets a benefit if something come out of it. Because of this, we've lost a lot of our earth has been poisoned. It's unclean. The climate's completely out of whack. We've just destroyed so much just to keep profits in the hands of a few. It's not worth it anymore. It's clear that we have to change. I know some people want to fight this. You got a whole mess of people that Trump and right wings and conspiracy theories are really galvanizing, but they're cutting their own throats. I can see it. And I don't mind telling people, hey man, you're just cutting your own throats. Many of them are working class, many of them are white, but it's not just white. I've seen Mexicans and some African Americans join in, but mostly they're white who have been told you're losing your whiteness, you're losing your privilege, you're losing your power. We got to stop these people of color, these migrants. We got to stop these free thinking people, from taking over. So they get scared, they get feared, then they go out there and do some crazy things, including go out there and try to get people to go back to work. I don't want to go back to the way things were. Normal wasn't good. The last time we had normal, we had homelessness everywhere. We had opiate deaths. We had suicide rates. We had people losing jobs. It wasn't good before. Normal was not good for us. Let's go back to something forward. Let's not go back, go forward towards something encompassing and inclusive and making sure that everybody's needs were met. Why is that such a hard, illegitimate idea? It's not illegitimate. It's the only idea that really matters. But yet we're being told, well, you can't have that idea because it's wrong, because it's communist, because Marx, because everything else. I go, you know what? Forget all that stuff. This is where the world has to go. You know what I'm saying? And this is the direction that we have to go. And the only reason anybody should even read Marx is because he was one of those people 150 years ago that was beginning to raise the consciousness, science, and understanding for anybody to get what was happening. And there's many more since then. That's the only reason to read them. I don't want to make a cult out of anybody. I want people to realize this is the life that everybody should be able to thrive in. And we can make it happen and everybody can contribute to it. So that's where we're at, not labeling, not pushing, scaring people, not saying this and that. I say, let's move forward. I want to say one other thing. I going back to the sweat lodges and my indigenous roots, I decided to go back to my native roots. My mother's Raramuri, which is also known as Tarahumara from Chihuahua, Mexico. I have connected with Native Americans here in the U.S. for over 25 years. I've done a lot of ceremony and Pine Ridge and Navajo land and other reservations all over LA and other cities. I look at ancestral knowledge, this old way of being, what they used to call primitive communism, or what they used to say barbarianism. They're always, that's not what it was. They were actually very well developed, wise people that all people had a connection with. Everybody in Europe, Asia, Africa, all over the Americas had a connection to that kind of way of thinking, connecting with nature, connecting with your own nature, connecting with the nature relationships, and even whatever you think the divine is, connecting all kind of ways. We've lost these, and I think that's going to help guide us for the times that we're in. These aren't archaic old ideas that I should be written off. Oh, that's old, let's move forward. Every new idea since then, every civilized idea has imprisoned us in one form or the other. And that's why everything's in crisis, because everything that was set up during the industrial, post-industrial world has been pretty much all in crisis, because it carries some of the old with it. It becomes not a womb for something new, but a tomb with a bunch of dead things that we're carrying with us every step of the way. So let's get rid of the tomb and let's be the womb for a new world.
Yeah. Yeah. You talk about building a new society. Actually, my next question was going to be, you already made the segue. Was a lot of your work though is about recovering that ancestral knowledge, particularly within the Chicano community, of who we are as indigenous, not our roots or heritage, but who we actually are as like indigenous people. Can you speak to some of the work that you've done
Yeah.
and are doing?
Well, to me, it's very important. I started going to Native American conferences in Wisconsin, Chicago, as a Chicano. But I always knew that Chicanos were indigenous. We just were uprooted. We didn't know what tribe we were from. You know, there's all kinds of things. We got Hispanicized, and then we got Americanized, and we don't know. There's so many layers to who we are. We forget that the deepest, most profound layer is that we're rooted in this land as deep as anyone. I'm talking about from the Mexicas, the so-called Aztecs, to Mayans, to Zapotecos, to Mixtecos, to Yaquis and Raramuris, and all the tribes. There's 68 languages that are now official languages of Mexico. There's not one official language in the US, not even English. But Mexico has 68 official languages, including Spanish, but a lot of them are indigenous. And Mexico has a long ways to even do it right, because they undermine a lot of the indigenous, but they're growing and developing. So my thing is, I got to get back to that. My book, the latest book I have, is From Our Land to Our Land. And it says that because there's a story where you're involved, where we spoke to, I think it was San Bernardino Valley College. And remember, there was a white guy that got up and started ranting and raving against all the Mexicans that were coming in. And it was just part of what Trump had opened doors. He was a muscle-bound, tattooed white guy screaming at young noisy Mexicans. And remember, we were thinking, maybe we'll knock him out, maybe we'll beat him up. But my idea was, let's just go forward, let him come in. If he wants to disrupt, we'll handle it, but let him come in. And he did. He didn't say peep. He actually snuck out and walked away. But the point was, I brought in this concept. When my family came across the border from Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, which is part of the Chihuahua Desert, into El Paso, Texas, so I could be born, which is also part of the Chihuahua Desert. The border comes in only within who knows how many years, 200 years, maybe even less than that. The Chihuahua Desert, we've had people for 10,000 years or more. I was being taken from our land to our land. You understand? The border was only recent. This is my land. I wasn't coming from Ireland. I wasn't coming in from Germany. I wasn't coming in from China. And I'm not against all these people. I'm saying that they're all great and it's wonderful. I'm just saying, don't take away my heritage. At the same time, it's like you're saying, this is not just heritage. We're real now. We're part of this area and community. What they're pissed about, and all those detention camps with Mexicans, but also Hondurans and Guatemalans, Salvadorans, and even people from Haiti, they're pissed off because these are people of the land that belong here. The indigenous is coming back in many ways, cosmologically and also in physical ways, to the land. And this is what I brought back to the Native Americans. And at first a few of them were pissed off, and what's this Hispanic doing here? They didn't like me, even though most of them were blue-eyed natives. I don't care if they're blue-eyed and they claim native, that's on them. I look more native than most of them, but it didn't matter. My attitude was, I belong here. And it changed over the years, believe it or not. They became more open, especially in Southwest with the Pueblo and the Navajo and a few other people. Uh, and then 20 years ago, my family got adopted by a Navajo elder. He adopted Trini, my wife, and the process adopted my whole family. So we've gone there and the reservation there in Lucachuca, Arizona for 20 years doing ceremonies and visiting. They treat my wife like a daughter. We have brothers and sisters there, and they're so beautiful. We go there and they treat us like, they love us. They're so wonderful, and they're so poor. And a few people don't know that Navajo Reservation has more of the COVID-19 pandemic going on per capita than any other place in the country. They're suffering a lot. They don't have any resources. So we're in touch with our family there just to make sure they're okay. But still, they opened up the world to me about my indigenous, and they've accepted me and my wife as indigenous from Mexico, but they don't care about the borders. They know that we're part of that whole stream of indigenous people. So that's where I go back to, and this is also where I go forward from. I bring that with me.
Yeah, I think no, that's wonderful. It's wonderful work you're doing. You mentioned a few things about the Navajo, what's going on right now in Navajo Nation. I don't think people are really aware of just how many. I mean, they're aware that things are rough, but they're not aware of just like how many things that they take for granted are just very, very different. You know, in reservation life and et cetera. Can you give us some examples of some of the struggles?
There's more per capita suffering from the COVID-19. What's happening is they're realizing that they don't have enough resources. Hospitals don't really exist as you would imagine. It's the largest Native American reservation in the country. It's got about 200,000 people, and it's spread out really widely through three or four different states. I think part of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and I think part of Colorado is part of this reservation. And they've been isolated, of course, being Native peoples, like all reservations. The reservations are the poorest pieces of land in the US. And they also have the highest alcoholism rate, suicide rate, drug, crystal meth rates. They've been suffering tremendously, despite all the, along with all the genocide and everything else that's happened over centuries. But the Dene are very strong people. They've been there a long time. There's a lot of traditional people. Not everybody on the reservation is traditional, but there's enough of them so that when you go down there, they do their ceremonies. They use the hogans. They have sweat lodges. They have amazing prayer meetings and all kinds of beautiful things that they do to stay connected. I'm glad to be adopted by them, and I feel I'm part of that family, and I treat it with a lot of respect. People should know, though, that they're suffering and they need help, but they need help as far as healthcare and testing and all kinds of things that we're having a hard time getting, even in Los Angeles, which is a big city with a lot of wealth. You can imagine how sadly they're not able to get what they need. And so I think bringing the word out that our Native peoples are suffering extra. As you know, it's been proven that people of color in general are suffering extra. African Americans particularly are being hit hard. Mexicano, Central Americans, and others are being hit hard, but also the Native Americans. And I would say among white people, it's really poor white people, especially the elderly, that are being hit. So people should realize it's the poor are predispositioned to be dying more and being affected by all these pandemics than anybody else, because we just don't have the health immunities that we should have. We've been feeding the wrong things and not getting the proper care. We're not prepared, and we're paying the extra price for just being poor. And so that's what's happening on the Navajo reservation.
Yeah, no, that's good to raise awareness, and we can put some links in the description here for those who can, for ways that we can materially help people out. I mean, material, like really actually not just talk about things, but actually put in work to improve or to help. I mean, I don't, there's no other way to put it, but yeah. So this is before this happened, you were looking at a pretty big year. Last year was a pretty big year for you. Your life is a series of big years strung together, but last year there was a couple milestones. you always running was interpreted into a play and was a huge success. I mean, I know you anticipated that was going to be a success, but the success, just how successful it was actually a surprise
Yeah.
to everyone involved. I mean, because it was you know, everyone knew it was going to be big, but like my God, it was.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
I have to thank Casa 0101 Theater in Royal Heights. It's a community theater. They've been struggling for a long time, but they've had some amazing shows, amazing performances, all based on our communities there in the East LA area. And they were open to doing Always Running as a play. I had already done the play before through Crossroads Theater that actually got very successful. 6,000 high school kids were brought into the LA Mark Taper Auditorium to see the play when it was shown there. And then it ended up in Ibar Theater in Hollywood, and we did very well. It was a play that I didn't write, though. I really didn't have much to do with it. And so it was okay. It just wasn't me. What the difference was this time is I co-wrote the play with my good friend Hector Rodriguez, who's been working in theater for 10 years and done many, many plays. We we did the play really based on what I felt was the vision, and which is the story about a fully formed gangster kid, not defiant to the world, didn't care about anything, about anybody, but being intervened by a mentor, conscious, revolutionary thinking Chicano activist who comes into this neighborhood and begins start impacting kids like him. He's actually, I was the only one that I actually got impacted, but I was also the one giving him the hardest time. Told him to drop dead. I don't want to say that defines a tension between, hey, don't come into my life. I don't need you, with somebody saying, yes, you do. You do need to know about the changes and what's going on and how you can go from your trauma to transformation, all these things. And I wanted to tell that story. I focused on it. The book, Always Running, covers a lot of ground, but I wanted to focus on that. It proved to be a great message. We sold out every weekend that it was on, from the end of August to the end of November. We extended it twice. In fact, we could have gone forever, except that eventually we decided that we would have to take it to another level. So we ended up in the end of November. More people wanted to see it. So we decided to take it to the Hollywood Fringe Festival, Theater Festival, which was going to be in June. We prepared for it. We have this cast. I rewrote the play to help fit some of that time schedule. We had the Hudson Theater in Hollywood, which is well known. They accepted us. And then the pandemic comes and everything's done. No more plays. Everything's been postponed. All my events starting in March got canceled. I had like 30,000 worth of speaking gigs to the end of summer gone. I was going to go Chicago, other cities, and they were all gone. And that's, I don't really complain in that everybody suffered. We're all
Yeah.
in this together. People have
How,
it worse than me, so
just
I'm not even. I'll be okay.
yeah.
Cons-
So my just artist, working artist question just pops on mind. Like how you see lost 30,000. Like in what time period? How fast did that
uh,
happen?
March, all of March started. April lost everything. We were going month by month, and then May, we're not going to be able to do anything. May hasn't even come here. We've already been canceled. I have events in June and July already canceled. So even though we haven't even got there, I've lost all this income. I'm not going to do any events out there. We're hoping that maybe in the fall, the French Hollywood Theater is supposed to, the theater festival is supposed to pick up in October. If all goes well, we'll try to do that if we can do it safely. If not, we're not going to force anything. And hopefully go through the fall and pick up a few things, pick up a few gigs. I'm able to survive because I had some savings. I'm able to pick up a few gigs doing speaking and virtually. I'm doing virtual classrooms. I'm doing some live streaming. I'm doing some Zoom conference calls. Some of it I get paid very little, but it's helping me. I've also been getting some money off my house, all kinds of things just to keep surviving. So in many ways, I'm in better shape. I lost his income, but I'm in better shape than others. I really want to let people know that we're all in this together, and I really feel the pain of all the people who can't do what I can do. Also, because we have Teatro Centro Cultural, they lost a lot of income. They got closed down. The bookstores closed. All our program is done, but they're doing very well virtually. We have a virtual open mic. We have a virtual social justice book club. We have a virtual um, indigenous cosmology. We have yoga even, So I would recommend that people please come to our website at diachucha.org. You can get to buy books online because even though we're not selling them physically, the online sales are moving up. We need that. We need you to support this community with books, but also all our events are all there at theachucha.org, and you can also donate. I'm asking people to help us just like everybody else. Donate what you can. So I'm putting a lot of effort in helping that our center that me and my wife started almost 20 years ago, and we're going to keep it going. So my energies are going to community, going to work with the indigenous peoples contingent out of the Poor People's Campaign. Me and my wife are part of that. We're helping spread that work as well, and I'm still active with the Poor People's Campaign, and I'm also part of the Union for the Homeless, which is now organizing homeless people all over the state of California, but also in other states where we're starting to pick up, giving the homeless their own agency as far as organizing and leadership. So I'm still active, even with this virtual world. Yeah.
Right. So I'm gonna interrupt this interview for a commercial. You heard it here, Luis Rodriguez. Book him on your Zoom for your classrooms. Bring him into your classroom. I've had the tremendous honor and I don't know what else to call it, just whatever of conducting workshops alongside him. I've seen his workshops. He's not just an amazing poet; he's an amazing workshop leader as well. So definitely book Luis Rodriguez. Now's the time. I mean, we're all stuck at home, and you're still conducting your classroom. So definitely do that. Last year also marks Cuba.
Yeah, wow, that was amazing. And I have to thank you, Matt, and of course, Professor Jose Prado, and just to help organize this. I'd never been to Cuba before. It's a dream I always had. I've been all over, but I never made it to Cuba. And so it was great. We were there in October of last year. We made it. We ended up in Havana. We're pretty much where we stayed. We were part of the Casa de Americas, a big conference on Latin American literature, and we had our own panel in which we got to do poetry and got to speak about the works we all did. Anyway, it was quite amazing. The people were amazing. The city of Havana is suffering. There has been boycotts and a bunch of stuff. There was blackouts, and there was a number of big lines for gas, but the people's spirit was all high. People were energized. Well, I didn't see the kind of poverty and pain that you see in the streets of Los Angeles. There was no homeless encampments. There was no, we saw maybe one drunk guy, funny guy, no big deal. We came across one prostitute. I know walking through LA, whole sections of prostitutes and whole sections of drunk alcoholic people on the street laying down. I'm just saying that even in LA with the richest city in the richest state in the richest country in the world, there's more pain and suffering there than in Havana, Cuba. Somebody was arguing with me that, well, the rest of Cuba is really poor. I'm sure the whole country's poor. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that they're poor, not poor in spirit. They're not poor in imaginations the way a lot of people here in this country are. Yes, they have a lot of pain and suffering, but they're doing the best they can with what they have. And we witnessed it. We were able to see it. And so that's what I want to say. I had another person who was trying to argue with me when I was talking about it that, oh, well, they got a dictatorship. What a terrible thing. I go, oh, yeah, what a terrible thing it is. A dictatorship, quote unquote. But look at all the great democracies like Mexico, like El Salvador, Guatemala. Got worse. Honduras. I've been in Honduras. I've been to El Salvador. I've been to Guatemala. I've been to the worst parts of Mexico. I was in Honduras for a month. Beautiful people, amazing people. Government is corrupt as you can imagine. Those are the great democracies. They're not dictatorships. They're all democracies, and they're going through worse hell than anything that's going on in Cuba. People have to re-evaluate and re-understand this idea of dictatorships and democracies. Some of the democracies are not democracies. Some of these so-called dictatorships have a lot of democratic things. We just have to understand that's not what people have told us. We have in this country almost a failed state in the United States. We can see it with this pandemic. Great democracy, land of freedom, all these great things. There's so much gaps and so much fissures in our country and in our governance. People have to challenge these things. They have to be very sharp and knowledgeable and study and realize this is what it is. Are there problems in Cuba? Of course, but I've been all over Latin America. Cuba is far ahead of any country in Latin America, even though they do have go through a lot of problems.
I got a lot of reactions too, and they were trying to convince me that the Cuban government was very sneaky and they were hiding the homeless. And I don't know where they hid the homeless. Maybe in homes. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, LA is a very sneaky place. I'm sure they try to hide the homeless because they're always moving them from one encampment to another. But guess what? There's so many of them they can't. They have cops arresting people. They used to go in there and destroy people's little bit of property they have, drag them out. There was so much stuff, and they can't get rid of it. You can see it. You can't get rid of the stuff. If it's there, it's there. When I was in San Salvador 25 years ago, working with the gangs, the Maras down there, I saw slums everywhere. When I was in Mexico City, and Juarez, some of the worst slums were in Ciudad Juarez, were in the area where I was born. Some of the worst slums I'd ever seen was there. This is not even that long ago, a few years ago that I was there. You can't hide this stuff. Yeah, people can try to hide it. In South Salvador, when they got a little better, they pushed them to the outside. So you don't see them going in from the airport like you used to see them from the airport going into the central city, but they're all out there. They're still, they can't really get rid of them. So I'm not saying everything in Cuba is great. I'm not that kind of person to say, you know, I'm not blinded, but I'm also open. My eyes are open. I can see this is not the same kind of level of pain and suffering that other people in the Americas, including in this country, the richest, most powerful country in the world, we're suffering a lot more than the people in Cuba.
So, absolutely, and that kind of gives us an example or an idea of the larger picture about Cuba. But specifically, we were there at Casa de las Americas, and there's people here who might not be aware of just what a historic place that is. And I've had some conversations. I've had many conversations between now and then and now with Viva Padilla and Iris Tianda about.
Oh yeah, who also joined us? Yeah, we got to make a mention them. Yeah.
And we've had a lot of I've had a conversation with them about like the significance of that, and I tell them, like, come on, you were at Casa de las Americas, you were there with this, and we were there, and to boost us up, and what that meant to, and we also just had a general conversation like, wow, we were there where Galeano spoke, where Roque Dalton had an office, where Mercedes Sosa sang. These things mean a lot to me and them, and they're more my contemporaries, right? And so none of us have accomplished some of the things that you've accomplished. Yet still, even with all your accomplishments, speaking of Casa de las Americas it's a huge thing. So to be part of that lineage, that heritage, can you speak to what that meant to you to be there, where all these just.
Well, to me, it's again touchstones. I had not been there. It's a touchstone of revolutionary ideas, literature, song, art. We need them in our country. As you know, we've struggled, you have too, as well as others, for that kind of art and that kind of literature and that kind of music and everything to come out. That's why we create places like theatres and others like that, to give expression to all this beautiful visual arts, murals, and everything that we fought for. So you go down to Casa Americas and you realize they were pioneering it. They were doing it for many, many years. They're still doing it. There's murals there. There's music. There's all this literature. They have a library of the most amazing books. In fact, we contributed books that we all have brought to there so they could see the books of the Chicanos, especially in LA, and Chicanos and Salvadorians, because it is the end that Salvadorian and Mexican, and the rest of us are Chicano, but we all understand the importance of the Salvadoran, Guatemalan Honduran community among us. So I think it was just amazing. I was honored beyond what you can imagine to be able to sit there and be part of this, and to kind of be part of that legacy that is going on. And I have to say, for everything that I've been through, good major accolades and honors, it's one of the highlights of anything I've ever done in my life. That I was in Casa de las Americas, that I was in Havana, and was able to be part of that amazing work. And my understanding is they're working on publishing our work as well as the work of others. So that's great. We're going to be published there in Havana. People need to understand all this, because, again, we don't understand. The world is giving us bad information about everything. There's fake news, absolutely, but fake news is coming from the people crying out about fake news. So we have to find the truth, and it can be done. We can discern. We can get the truth. I'm prepared to talk to people about this. I understand all the problems in these places, but I get to context it, textualize it, having been all over the Americas, having been on other parts of the world, having been all around the country. I've been in every state of the United States except for Alaska. So it's important for people to know we can discern where knowledge is, what things are happening, why things are bad, how so-called democracy actually could be worse than so-called dictatorships. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not saying that all these dictatorships are all that great either, so-called dictatorships, but I'm just saying you got to have different reference points to understand them, which nobody gives you. So you people just end up saying what other people tell you. So that's what I think is important.
Yeah, no, definitely. I myself, it's interesting. I've been conducting so many interviews, and I kind of talking away sometimes like I don't exist. Like I'm, I'm just like, and how was that? And I was like in the room. But of course, that was an amazing trip for me as well. And I don't know, it's probably that it's far and away the highlight of anything I've ever done. But it was a real honor to do that with you. It was really honored to do that with you, with Jose, with Iris, with Viva. But you and I have worked together a bit over the past few years, and that's probably the biggest thing. The thing that most, the biggest calling card I have, I guess, is that I've had an opportunity to work with you several times. Um, and one of those times we worked together has made its way into a book, your most recent book. And I saw that you had you talked about this story in the Los Angeles Times, and I'm very interested in some of the other stories in there as well. Um, but this may be a good segue, good entry point into the latest book. Can you tell us about that show, that fateful show in San Bernardino Valley College?
Yeah, I think that was because I wanted to start my essay book with that story. It's from an essay that's called The End of Belonging. And again, it comes back from the understanding that Mexicans, Chicanos, Central Americans, we're not really foreigners, strangers, aliens, we are part of this land. If you go to those detention camps, and I've been to Eloy, an immigration detention camp, I've seen the people, you see the brown skin. If you got brown skin at any level, you're indigenous to this land. You know what I'm saying? Some, of course, Mexicans have blonde hair, blue eyes, and there's African among us, and we have so much. But the big chunk of who we are is Native, and over the years, I've also noticed that Native Americans have accepted many Chicanos as Native. This is why almost 75% of all sun dancers, which is part of the Plains Native traditions, is Chicano. So from our land to our land was that essay exposed this racist who was going around speaking badly to all the Mexicans, and now they got kind of got license from Trump and everybody to just bring the racism out, which is fine because now we can spot the racism out away. But we weren't intimidated. It didn't stop us, and we had a great gathering. I would say, maybe I'm wrong, I'm not good with numbers, 300 to 400 people were in that room, all standing room only, and you and me got to read and talk, read poetry, perform poetry, as well as talk on the issues. And I think it was part of the basis for me to say, now it's time for me to bring an essay book that can really describe who we are. People don't know what Chicanos are. I guess the subtitle is called Essays, Journeys, and Imaginings from a Native Chicanx Writer. I wanted Chicanx to be in the title of a book. It's probably the only book in US publishing with Chicanx in the title. Does that mean that I want people to start using this term? No, I don't really care what you call yourself, but it does mean that we will call ourselves what we are. We've been labeled Latinos, Hispanics, Mexican Americans, all these things that are all made up terms. They're all made up. You know what I'm saying? So it's time for us to name who we are, how we want to name it. Chicanos from 40, 50 years ago was the way that we expressed who we were, breaking across all borders, including Mexico, but also our US experience, which had a lot of discrimination, a lot of genocidal things going on. So we needed to speak on that. And now Chicanx just means Chicanos, but also encompassing of everyone, all genders, as well as gender non-conforming people. We're bringing in everybody. Maybe it'll change years from now. Who cares? I think the idea is that we get to name ourselves. We need to get to find our place. We belong everywhere, anywhere we land our feet in this earth. And that's what we got to be able to say. Yes, I have a passport. Yes, I'm a US citizen because I was born in El Paso. Yes, I have all these things, but none of that is important, is that I am a human being. And as much as you might love your city, you might be part of your state, you might love your country, we can't love that more than we love the world. The world is our place. All humanity is important. All humanity should be valued. And that's more important for me than any border, any passport, anything else. I use passports because I travel around the world, and I don't mind, I recognize that. But I'm not stuck to that to the point where I can't recognize that all of us belong in this world. And everything this world has to give should belong to the rest of us.
Yeah. I've taken up so much of your time. I think we have time. Do you have time to answer a couple, one or two questions from the audience?
Absolutely, I'm totally into it.
Okay, cool. So we have some questions from the audience. I'm sorry, I'm going to apologize right now. I don't have time to ask everyone's questions. I've taken up so much of Luis's time already. Really appreciate you, Luis, coming on. This question comes from Christina Costa. She says, "Who you actually met at the Olivio show? Who's also mentioned in the book, the show at Olivio that got covered in the LA Times." So big shout out to Eric.
No, yeah.
Yeah. So Eric, never say I didn't do anything for you, man. I'm bringing you up right now. All right. Christina Acosta says, "Hello, Luis. Thank you for sharing your testimonial." Then there's a heart. Would you mind sharing a poem? Well, I don't know if you have time for this, but would you mind sharing a poem or a line from a poem from those African American poets that inspired you, as you mentioned earlier? I also love poetry and enjoy reading. It was something that helped me get away from traumatic situations as a youth.
Well, I want to give one line, and it wasn't African American. Theodore Rodkey, one of my favorite poets. He ended up committing suicide. He was, I think, schizophrenic. He had a lot of issues, but he ended up doing amazing poetry. He has one of my favorite lines in poetry, and it goes, "What is madness but the nobility of soul at odds with circumstance?" I love that line because I always felt that I was one of these people. I joined La Vida Loca. I was mad, madness in the world that was, I couldn't reconcile with the capitalist world that I was growing up into. I couldn't reconcile with the phony patriotism and the US over everybody. And I couldn't reconcile with any of that. I thought that was mad. So we all become mad in our own way. And unfortunately, I fell into it. It was suicidal, homicidal. I thought I would die in a blaze of glory. Let me get shot by my enemies. Let me die with a heroin overdose. Anything that we didn't conscious do that, but that's what we were doing. We accepted this fatalism that none of us were worth it, and we all deserved to go that way. I think the consciousness and awareness was, wait a minute, my madness wasn't the problem, is that my soul, my inner being could not reconcile with the madness of the world. And that's where poets and artists and organizers and thinkers kind of began to see, none of us can reconcile with this world. And even with this pandemic, we could see that. I can't reconcile with the way Trump is running things, with the way the Democrats and Republicans are falling over each other, the way they can handle the fissures and the gaps and things that have been exposed. We have to now recognize that we can't reconcile with that world, that we're not really the mad ones, you know what I'm saying? That normality is mad, normality is crazy, that we have to find a sanity through all of this and get back to a world that really is embracing and loving and caring for every one of us. And I think that's where we're at. And so I really love that line. The circumstances has driven us mad, but it's really not our madness. It's our souls cannot reconcile with that world that has completely lost its shape, lost its vision, lost its source, lost its direction. We have to think of a world in which we all get back to a real sanity. And the only sanity that matters is everyone well-being, everybody shared well-being is the key and goal of every society.
Okay, beautiful. I mean, it's not for me to comment though. So next question comes from Karina Akripais, who you met. You've met Karina. She says, "Hi, Luis. Where can we read more about your experience as a journalist? Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom."
So as you know, I have two memoirs. Always Running is my most well-known. The second one I actually like better. That's just me. It's called It Calls You Back, because the madness will call you back. Even though I left the drugs, I left the gang violence, and I left going to jails by 19 years old, 19, 20, I was done. The madness will call you back many ways. And it took the form of my life as rage. I was constantly raging. I had to control this rage. I lost a lot of relationships. I lost my relationship with my kids. I lost a lot of friendships. I'm a nice guy. People see me, but I had this really post-traumatic thing. That's why I didn't know what it was. I got diagnosed by friends of mine who are psychiatrists who say, you have this. I didn't understand it, but I was the rage. But the second thing that it took the form was drinking. I drank for 20 years after I let go 7 years of drugs. And so I had to realize that the madness is calling me back in some form. And that madness of La Vida Loca, that was a response to the madness of the world. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So It Calls You Back is to try to say that, and it also called my son. My son got called into that world. heavy duty gangster. He ended up doing 15 years in prison. If anybody can read my memoir, I would recommend reading It Calls You Back, because that's where I get into my development in the industry world, as a union organizer, as a journalist, as a poet, as trying to be a father again, trying to be a father to I got 4 kids, 5 grandkids, and 4 great grandkids. So my family's growing, trying to deal with relationships, because I've been married 3 times, lived with 2 other women, and had all these relationships that were not healthy. I've learned to be healthy. Me and Trini now have a healthy partnership. We've been together for 35 years, and we've grown together. So I think It Calls You Back would be the book to read about a lot of that went on with my life.
Yeah. Just so for those know, I see that there's 37 different comments. I can only see a couple comments at a time, so I'm actually being helped out right now by Karina, who's feeding me some of the questions here. So thank you, Karina. And also, so this kind of final question here that I got is from, give me 1 second. Oh my goodness. From Carly McKeon. What was the second title of the poetry book again? What was it? What was the title of the second poetry book again?
Oh, it's called The Concrete River. And I recommend that book. Again, it's a best-selling poetry book in the US. If you sell 1,000 copies, you're like jumping up and down for joy. It's really hard to sell poetry in this country. I was fortunate that that book has probably sold 15,000 copies. That's really a lot. And so that's my best-selling poetry book. I have 8 poetry books, many of them have sold different numbers, but that has sold a lot. And I recommended The Concrete River, my second poetry book. I don't even know how I put it together, but I did. So that would be the book to read that's been the best selling. Of course, my latest book I love a lot, which is called Borrowed Bones. It's a chapbook. It's great. I use it. I put it in my back pocket. It works very well. It's got my new work, and I'm also working on a new poetry collection. I don't know when it'll be out, maybe 2 or 3 years, but I'm trying to put that together. Having been poet laureate of Los Angeles, I've taken that poet laureate energy to try to keep doing more poetry, more readings, and connect with people who I think have poetry inside of them.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, Luis, I want to thank you for sharing, for joining us this hour. I want
Great
to.
session, man. I enjoyed myself. Great questions, and it's too bad that I couldn't get more into questions for all the people. But people should just come to my website, luisjrodriguez.com. I'll inform people about some of the stuff that's happening. They should go to theatucha.org. Buy books online, get onto the virtual classes and workshops that we're doing, support these community centers, including the center that Matt works for. We need all your backing. We're the ones that are trying to bring forth some great energy, some great thoughts, some great vision, some great truth. So I think that that's where people should go. Also, I want to say I have a Hummingbird Cricket Hour podcast with my wife, Trini. We've done about 24 podcasts already. You can get that online. Just go to the Hummingbird Cricket Hour. It probably shows up on Google, one of the first things. And we're on Applecast, we're on Libsyn, we're a few places. Listen to what we're saying. We're trying to explore these very issues in that podcast.
Well, I want to thank again Luis Rodriguez. This has been the Dawes Center for the Arts speaker series. The Dawes Center for the Arts is a nonprofit based in Pomona, California, where we're an art gallery as well as an art space, as well as an art workshop and art lab. We're really trying to inspire people to not even inspire people. We're trying to help people get what is in them out into the world. So again, there's there's only Luis Rodriguez who I can really point to, who has done that kind of work for this long. And Luis, you're a treasure to our community, and I really appreciate you.
No, I really appreciate that very much. I'm honored. Thank you.
Stay tuned.
All right. I'm gone. Bye-bye.